The thing about karma is that it doesn't always come with thunder or fire. Sometimes it walks in quietly wearing a badge and a courtroom suit. That's exactly how it came for Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, the man who couldn't stop talking about one of the biggest unsolved murders in hip-hop history. For years, he built a name off a confession he now wishes he'd never made. He turned Tupac's death into a story, his story, until that same story wrapped around his neck like a noose. It started as street legend. Keefe D was the guy who knew what happened that night on the Vegas Strip, the night Tupac and Suge Knight's BMW was riddled with bullets. He said he was in the white Cadillac. He said his nephew, Orlando Anderson, pulled the trigger. And he said Diddy had something to do with it. Those interviews made him famous again, but they also made him a walking contradiction. 1 minute bragging, the next pleading innocence. By the time police finally came knocking, he wasn't the cold storyteller from Vlad TV anymore. He was a trembling old man saying they got it all wrong. I'm innocent. It was almost painful to watch, a man who'd spent years capitalizing on violence, suddenly trying to outpray his own past. On camera, Keefe talked about how God got his back, but the truth is, he'd already turned his back on every code he once claimed to live by. In gang culture, silence is sacred. You don't talk, you don't write books, and you definitely don't go on national television detailing who fired what gun. Yet Keefe did all of that because he thought he was untouchable. The irony is that he wasn't even caught by new evidence. He was caught by his own mouth. Every interview, every boast, every exclusive retelling became part of the prosecution's case file. They didn't need new witnesses, they just needed YouTube. His voice, his words, his ego, that's what sealed it. Prosecutors in Las Vegas are now preparing to build an entire case out of his own storytelling, and what started as bragging rights has turned into the biggest self-snitch in modern hip-hop. People close to Tupac, especially members of the Outlaws like Napoleon, weren't surprised. They said Keefe's downfall was written the moment he traded loyalty for clout. He told on himself, Napoleon said, and he's not wrong. Every clip of Keefe smirking while describing that night feels heavier now. Because the same details that made him internet famous are the ones keeping him behind bars. The story gets darker when you realize how much fear is now attached to his name, not from power, but from shame. Inside jail, Keefe isn't a legend, he's a liability. Reports say he's being kept apart from other inmates for his own protection, especially since so many of them grew up idolizing Tupac. To them, Keefe isn't a gangster. He's a man who mocked their hero's death and broke the very code that kept their world spinning. One guard reportedly overheard someone say, "He better hope Pac's ghost don't got hands." There's a tragic poetry in that. The same streets that once celebrated Keefe now see him as a traitor. And even his old gang ties, the Southside Compton Crips, have turned brittle. He thought his connections would save him. Instead, they've made him paranoid. Sources say he's been writing letters, trying to reach old friends, begging them not to retaliate. Because deep down, he knows what the streets do to men who talk too much. But even if the streets forgave him, the internet won't. His every interview, every line about what really happened is still online, digitally eternal. The very platforms that gave him fame now serve as his prosecutors. In a way, Keefe D isn't just fighting a court case, he's fighting against his own echo. And that's a battle no one ever wins, because when your own voice becomes the evidence, silence starts to sound like freedom. In jail, time doesn't move. It lingers. For Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, every second drags like a reminder that the game he once glorified finally cashed its check. Gone are the cameras, the podcast lights, and the interviews that made him feel larger than life. What's left now is silence, and that silence has teeth. Inside Clark County Detention Center, Keefe's name carries no respect. It carries tension. He's surrounded by men who grew up blasting Tupac's "Me Against the World," and now the man accused of orchestrating Pac's murder sleeps only a few cells away. Officers describe him as paranoid, constantly checking over his shoulder. He eats separately, moves under escort, and rarely speaks unless spoken to. They say he's aged 10 years in the last few months. The same man who once strutted through interviews now sits with his head down, afraid to even make eye contact. The fear isn't of the guards, it's of the inmates who see him as the ultimate betrayal of street code. And in that world, betrayal doesn't fade with time, it festers. The tension started the moment word spread that Keefe had been moved into protective housing. To outsiders, it sounded like a safety measure. To inmates, it was confirmation that he'd folded, that he was scared. And in prison, fear smells like blood. Some of his old associates, men who once shared his colors, have distanced themselves completely. Others reportedly brag that they'd never talk like Keefe did. Inside that culture, talking isn't just a mistake, it's the highest form of disrespect. Still, Keefe keeps repeating the same line in every phone call that leaks out. God got my back. It's almost like a nervous tick now, a prayer mixed with denial, but it's hard to pray your way out of a story you built yourself. He knows that every word he ever said is being dissected by prosecutors and hip-hop fans alike. The streets are whispering, the internet's laughing, and the courtroom's waiting. And somewhere in between, a 60-year-old man is realizing that the same voice that made him famous is the one tearing him apart. Those close to the investigation say Keefe's lawyers are preparing a defense centered on manipulation. They'll claim the police, the ghostwriters, and even TV producers twisted his words for entertainment. They'll point to his age, his health, his bad memory, anything to paint him as a confused old man caught in the crossfire of media and fame. But prosecutors aren't buying it. They have hours of footage showing him describing the shooting with clinical precision, where the cars were, who was in which seat, even the angle of the gun. That's not confusion, that's confession. Outside the jail, the public debate has taken on a life of its own. Some say Keefe is finally paying for what he bragged about. Others argue he's a scapegoat, a pawn in a story too big for one man to carry. Conspiracy theorists still point to names like Reggie Wright Jr. and Diddy, saying the real masterminds are free, but none of those claims change one simple fact. Keefe put himself in that Cadillac on record again and again. Every empire built on lies eventually crumbles, and his is collapsing in real time. Even former death row members who once stayed quiet are beginning to speak. They call it karma. They say it's the universe balancing the books. And maybe they're right, because Keefe's downfall feels less like a police case and more like a parable, a story about what happens when pride becomes louder than reason. In the end, what terrifies him most isn't the sentence he might face, it's the silence that follows. The interviews are over, the audience is gone. All that's left is a man alone with the truth he spent decades trying to sell. When the trial date was announced, it felt like the world was watching history rewind itself. The Las Vegas courtroom became a theater, and Dwayne Keefe D. Davis was the main act in a story he'd been narrating for years. The irony couldn't be sharper. He once sold his version of events to anyone with a microphone, and now those same recordings were stacked on a prosecutor's desk as evidence. The showman had become the show. Inside that courtroom, there won't be any new gun found, no shocking DNA twist, no fresh witness stepping out of the shadows. The prosecution's case is built entirely on Keefe's own words, his interviews, his book, and his voice echoing through 100 podcast clips. They plan to play them back to back, letting the jury hear how his story shifted each time the lights turned on. In one clip, he laughs while describing the night Tupac was shot. In another, he swears he was 300 miles away. Each contradiction becomes another nail in his defense. The defense team knows this. That's why their strategy is all about sympathy. They'll paint Keefe as a man manipulated by fame, misunderstood by the internet, and exploited by cops who needed a confession. They'll say he was old, desperate, and confused. A storyteller who blurred fantasy with memory. But that narrative falls apart when his own pride is played out loud. No jury forgets a man bragging about murder like it was a movie scene. For the city of Las Vegas, this case means more than just closure. It's redemption. After nearly 3 decades of ridicule for failing to solve Tupac's killing, authorities finally have someone to put on trial. And while some call it justice, others call it desperation, because even if Keefe is convicted, it doesn't answer the one question that has haunted hip-hop for 30 years. Who really pulled the trigger? Orlando Anderson, the nephew Keefe once named, is long dead. Every other suspect tied to that Cadillac has vanished or been buried. What's left is a man whose biggest crime might have been talking too much. Still, there's something symbolic about it all. Tupac believed his words would outlive him, and they did. His music became immortal. Keefe believed his words made him powerful, and they destroyed him. Two men connected by the same night, both learning in different ways how words can change everything. One became a legend, the other became a warning. As the trial draws closer, hip-hop fans debate what justice even means anymore. Some say locking Keefe away won't bring Tupac back. Others argue it's not about closure. It's about accountability, about showing that even street fame and old age can't erase what you brag about on camera. And yet, beneath all the noise, there's a quiet truth echoing through it all. If Keefe had just stayed silent, none of this would be happening. He once said, "I shouldn't have said nothing." Those words might be the truest thing he's ever spoken, because the cameras that once gave him fame will now replay his downfall, frame by frame, until the jury doesn't see a gangster, they see a man undone by ego. No gun needed, no snitch required, just a microphone and a lifetime of contradictions. When the verdict finally comes, whatever it is, it won't change the legend of Tupac Shakur. Pac's story was sealed the moment those bullets hit the Vegas night. But for Keefe D, this is the final verse of a song he never stopped singing. In the end, his legacy won't be power, money, or fear. It'll be a cautionary tale told in the same breath as the man he claimed to know so well. A reminder that some stories should never have been told at all.